Good morning, everyone. We sincerely welcome you to our book discussion of Gender, Race, and Power, Examining IR Through an Intersectional Lens, written by our speakers today, Drs. Joyce Kaufman and Kristen Williams. My name is Lauren Van Metre, and I am the President and CEO of Women in International Security. Women in International Security, pronounced WIIS, is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization, and we are dedicated to advancing leadership opportunities in the international peace and security field and fostering engagement that links evidence-based scholarship, like the work that you will hear today, to policy and practice. WIIS supports its mission by bridging research to action, linking academic, policymaking, and practitioner domains through integrative policy analysis, stakeholder engagement, policy-driven publications, mentoring, and professional development programs. We have a network of members, national chapters, and international affiliates, which spans nearly 50 countries across 6 continents. If you would like to learn more about our organization and perhaps even join us as a member, which we would love, you can now do so with a 15% discount, and please visit the resources tab in the Zoom webinar. The links will also be in the chat. For today's book talk, we are joined by authors Joyce Kaufman and Kristen Williams. We really are thrilled to be able to discuss your new book, Kristen and Joyce. It comes at a very timely moment. As an international security community, we're facing increasingly complex and disruptive challenges to our peace architecture, and applying an intersectional approach, which you all suggest, to such emerging security threats is ever more important, as we must preserve and strengthen women's diverse leadership in this field. So I look forward to the discussion and also the practical recommendations on how this can be done. And I will now turn over this session to Dr. Karin Johnston, our Director of Development, to introduce our speakers and moderate the event. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren. If we go back to Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, intersectionality was introduced as a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power. Since the concept of power is at the core of the discipline of international relations, you would think that intersectionality would fit right into IR theory and claim its place as an approach to conducting empirical research. But this is not the case. This is why Joyce and Kristen's book, Gender, Race, and Power, Examining IR Through an Intersectional Lens, is the right book, the right time, and aimed at the right audience. It is the right book because it shows us that building onto traditional paradigms, breaking some of the traditional limitations of IR studies, gets us closer to a comprehensive analysis of critical IR topics that advance scholarship in the field and, for policymakers, for example, can benefit decision outcomes. It is the right time because we face an increasingly complex and shifting foreign and security environment, and the book details in its chapters how we gain explanatory power by applying an intersectional analysis to emerging problems, climate, environment, but also in more mainstream IR issues, war, peace and security, human rights, humanitarian intervention, and the global economy and development. And it is a primer that rightly speaks to those studying and working in IR who will benefit from an approach that enriches IR by extending its empirical reach and deepening our knowledge of issues that a broader understanding of IR brings. Let me give our audience a brief introduction to our authors first. You can find more detailed biographies of our speakers in the resources tab of the Zoom webinar. Joyce Kaufman is Professor Emerita of Political Science and founding director of the Center for Engagement with Communities at Whittier College. She has published on many issues in U.S. foreign and security policy and is currently serving as director of the Women, Peace, and Security Program of the Institute of World Affairs in Washington, D.C. And Kristen Williams is professor of political science at Clark University. She has published on hegemony and international relations, nationalism and ethnic conflict, and gender in war. So let us begin our discussion. Joyce, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction and for doing such a great summary of why this book is important. We also want to thank WIIS, thank Lauren for her introduction, thank Mahati for her hard work in putting this together, and we really appreciate it. I'm going to start by defining the context for this work by explaining a little bit about our collaboration and how we got to this point. It's important to note both Kristen and I are trained in very traditional international relations. And we were at a meeting together at USC that was facilitated by Ann Tickner, and Cynthia Enlow was the speaker. And this is a number of years ago. Kristen, I don't even remember how many years ago it was. At that time, both of us were working on books on former Yugoslavia. And Cynthia, as she often does, said, I want all of you to think about your research. Where are the women? And over lunch, Kristen and I talked about how neither of us in our respective work had anything to do with women. And that started our first collaboration, which looked at the ways in which states gender nationalism, focusing on the former Yugoslavia. That grew into a number of other books on women in conflict, including women working for peace, which is their the traditional gender role, but also women engaging in political violence and women supporting war, which runs counter to the traditional gender roles. We got a USIP grant to look specifically at post-conflict transformation and transition that brought together a group of international scholars. The point is, we went from very traditional IR to looking at gender and IR, and now to this book, which for us was a new way of engaging with the discipline. And Kristen will talk more about that part of our journey. Kristen?
Again, thank you, everybody. Yes, that was in December of 2000 that Joyce and I
Oh my
first
God.
at this USC thing. And actually a shout out to WIIS, because I first met Joyce when I was a graduate student and had come out for the WIIS event. There was where graduate students were brought out, and that's when I first met Joyce. So kudos, it's all WIIS, basically, WIIS and Cynthia Enlow. Yes, as Joyce said, we had been writing a number of books, edited volumes, and co-authored our books. Focusing on women for the most part and gender. And then when one of Joyce's publishers had approached her about writing a book on women and gender again, Joyce said, well, I would like to work with Kristen. And so she talked with me. And at that point, I said, there's a lot on gender and women, as we know, right? And we're also sort of recognizing the evolution of the field is not just about gender, but also about intersectionality. So going back to, Karin, what you were just saying at the beginning, at the introduction. And so, but because neither of us had really focused on intersectionality before, it became really an opportunity for us to learn a lot about intersectionality, obviously going back to Crenshaw's work. And again, reflecting the evolution of feminist scholarship and gender analysis, not just focusing on women and gender, but obviously incorporating other categories such as class, race, ethnicity, religion, and so forth. It also enabled us to focus on post-colonial scholarship that I also was not well versed in, so that was a great opportunity as well. And then marrying the two together, post-colonial feminist scholarship, so that was very helpful for us. And that really is what this book focuses on. It doesn't mean we're replacing or abandoning traditional IR, but we found it offers a different lens. So that's where we are with this book today.
Terrific. And that's gives us lots of opportunities to discuss this at various levels then. But let me just begin the discussion by asking why, as you outlined in your book, is it necessary that we abandon in some ways or our traditional approach to defining security and embrace a broader human security framework and intersectional approach? How is it better equipped to assess today's political and security environment?
I think for us, the less about abandoning as opposed to recognizing the limitations of the traditional IR approaches. So, and therefore intersectionality provides an alternative lens. So thinking about and then allows us to ask different questions that traditional IR does. So think about, realism, as we, all know, about focusing on hard power, security, competition between states. We can think about liberalism, the role of international institutions and state cooperation. But neither of these consider issues of gender. Neither of them consider issues of race. And that's where we think that there's an opportunity in thinking about applying intersectionality. And this is where, again, feminist IR, post-colonial feminist IR approaches can actually be very useful to understanding traditional topics of security and war, for example, and conflict. And so, thinking about the research that talks about post-conflict reconstructions often gendered, or the gendered backlash that comes to women's gains that they might have made during a conflict and what happens afterwards. We know about domestic violence increasing after the formal end of hostilities. And so for us, intersectionality allows us to introduce different questions about security. For example, not just who makes the decisions, say to go to war, but how different groups are affected by the decisions and in what ways.
And if I could just add a little to that, going back to your introduction, Karin, about the right book at the right time, we are dealing in an environment that's changing rapidly. The whole concept of security is changing. The shift from a Department of Defense to Department of War changes the emphasis, and yet for us as we think about approaching these issues, what an intersectional approach allows us to do is to move beyond those labels, to say it's not about Department of Defense or Department of War, but really it's about who makes the decisions, but also who is affected by those decisions. And that's something that we're seeing is changing rapidly right now. And I think one of the things this approach can do, as Kristen said, is it's not abandoning a traditional approach, it's building on it and also allowing us to not only ask different questions, but find different ways of answering some of those questions so we can broaden our understanding. And especially now, I think that's extremely important.
Yes, yes. In your book also, you examine several emerging security challenges in your chapters, including public health insecurity, for example, COVID-19, as you write about, climate insecurity. Who is most affected by these security challenges? How can an intersectional analysis help us better understand how the impact of these issues affect different gendered, racialized, and minority groups?
I think we would suggest that we start by redefining the question a little bit to ask how this range of security challenges, such as public health, climate insecurity, etc., affect different groups differently. And again, this requires looking within the country at the various groups that are affected. In the book, and for those of you in the audience, we hope you will buy it. There's a plug there. But
Joyce?
in the book, one of the things we do is begin each section on war, peace and security, human rights, humanitarian intervention, global economy and development, the environment, with a discussion of how it's approached by traditional IR. And we think that that's the logical starting point for this discussion. As we said, we're asking to move beyond the traditional approaches. So that's our starting point in each chapter. And what we ask is what we gain by approaching that particular issue from an intersectional perspective, specifically by highlighting what the more traditional approaches to IR really do not address. For example, in the book, and Karin alluded to this, we use COVID-19 as a case study. And we picked that specifically because it's an example of how different groups in different countries were affected by the disease. And in a broader sense, the impact of the disease on the economy and the development of these various countries. And I'll come back to the case studies in a minute. And the two case studies we really focus on are South Africa and India. We start with the understanding that public health is a common good. And that's a sort of a given. But we also know that access to health care varies by country and even within country. And we see that certainly in the United States right now. We think what an intersectional analysis allows us to do is to better understand those differences, both across countries, but especially within countries, and why those differences exist and emerge. So what it allows us to do is look within the country and explore the differential impacts of health policy decisions. So health policy decisions do not affect all groups within a country the same way, and we think that's important. In the words of Valeria Escoval and Karina Rodriguez and Enriquez, and this is a quote, "The COVID-19 crisis has exposed in one go the fragilities of developing economies, the inequalities and weaknesses of health systems, the vulnerabilities in labor markets, and the failing of social protection services in plain sight." So as we were thinking about how we could really use an intersectional approach to illustrate some of these points, COVID-19 seemed to be a really good example of ways in which we could delve within the country. And we use two case studies. We use a case study of South Africa and India. And throughout the book, we draw on case studies to illustrate our points and to make them more concrete. In the case of South Africa, apartheid ended in 1994, yet it remains a country deeply divided by race. And COVID made that inequality even more apparent. We cite a study that found that, quote, Blacks, Indians, and coloreds, that is, people of mixed race, were more likely to die than white South Africans. So we can look within that country to see the differential impact of a disease based on race, which is also tied directly to class issues, especially in South Africa. And if we look at gender as another variable, it is clear that women suffered much more than men. They faced more job losses, economic hits in a country where especially Black women were already suffering. So what this allowed us to do is look within the country and really pick apart these pieces to look at the ways in which the disease affected people differently. And that's an example of an intersectional analysis. In India, we also found these differences that are worth looking at. And again, India is a country that's developing rapidly, showing great economic growth, and yet very differential impact of that growth on different groups. And in looking at COVID, we see that very, very dramatically. The lockdowns that took place in India added to the burden of unpaid labor, especially on women, and that's women at all levels. So even the upper castes were affected by it. But the caste system especially exacerbated the differences. So even though women in the upper castes, the upper class women were affected, the lower castes, especially the Dalits, the untouchables, the lowest caste, were the most vulnerable. They suffered the most. So they tended to be isolated. They were in community quarantine centers. All of this reinforced societal differences, economic differences, class differences, but also prejudices. So again, the point is, by looking at that particular case, we could really see the impact of the disease on the different groups in a way that if we looked at a more traditional or macro level approach, we would miss those differences and often ignore some of the impacts and differential impacts of the disease. Kristen, anything to add?
No, I think you covered it. Absolutely.
Okay.
Great. I'd like to dwell a little bit on gender and the Women, Peace and Security Act. As you know, we are approaching the 25th anniversary of the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in October of this year. And could you explain why an intersectional approach to WPS is important and what it might look like? What concrete steps can we take as an international peace and security community to get to an intersectional WPS vision?
And thank you for that question. And I think our answer to this one is going to be a little bit longer because it's a far more complex and detailed question. And let me start by saying that with the 25th anniversary of 1325, we don't want to minimize the importance of that resolution and the subsequent resolutions for the way they highlighted the important role that women can and do play. I think that that's really important to stress. It was a critical a first step and has been built on. That said, we also want to reframe the issue a little bit so we can look at 1325 from different, that is, multiple perspectives and points of view. And to your question, Karin, what we really want to look at is how an intersectional approach helps us better understand the strengths, but also the weaknesses of 1325, given the importance of the important role it played. Okay, we all know, any of us who've studied this knows the strengths and the importance of 1325. It was the first major international agreement to draw attention to women. It was approved unanimously. It raised to the top of the international agenda the important role of women, and we cannot minimize that. It originated from women's organizations, from grassroots movements, bottom up, something else we don't see very often. And yet that grassroots movement grew into not only this resolution, but all the resolutions that built on it and followed it. And that's important. It's important, and one of its major strengths is it set the goals that countries could work toward. Specifically as a reminder of the way for countries to incorporate women into the peace processes, the important role that women can play in the peace process. And it calls for countries to establish national action plans. And those have been especially important in helping countries determine how they could implement the elements of 1325 and subsequent resolutions. And all of this cannot be minimized for the role 1325 played. That said, I'm now going to address or start to address some of the critiques or weaknesses which an intersectional analysis really can highlight. And this is where that approach is important. First of all, women who tend to be included in the peace process, as advocated by 1325, we can ask, do they really represent the women in their society? So even though it brings women to the table, and it's important for women to have a seat at the table, do they really represent the women in their society in terms of race, ethnicity, class, education, etc.? In other words, who do these women represent when they're sitting at the table? The point here is that women are not a homogeneous group. And by clumping women together, it overlooks, dismisses the fact that women are very different, and women within societies are very different. Bringing women in the peace process often comes from the top down. In other words, since it's the government who allows the women to participate in the peace process in most cases, often they reflect the views of the government. They are reflective of the people, the men often, who are already at the table. And what that means is those women often reflect a certain point of view rather than the grassroots. And as I said, one of the strengths is that 1325 grew from a grassroots movement. And yet, when we look at who sits at the table, it's often top down. When we think about working from the bottom up, which is a different approach, it means not only including women, and here's where the intersectional approach comes in, but also other groups, the groups that are often most marginalized by the conflict, such as people from different ethnic groups, LGBTQ plus people, other groups who are not the ones who are represented at the table in most cases, because they're often the ones who are most marginalized. Monica McWilliams, who was very instrumental in the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition and helping to bring peace to Northern Ireland, notes that if women are to be included, the existing structures and systems have to change. That the way they exist, women are often excluded, and this requires a structural change. Just saying that women should be included is not enough. If there are so many existing social, political barriers and structures that make it impossible for women to participate. And one of the examples that is often used is lack of access to childcare. Women often can participate in many of these political events within a country or peace processes because they're the primary caregivers. They're the ones who are taking care of the children. And until those structures change, women will be excluded, or only a small group of women will actually be included.
I can just sort of add to that too, and thinking about the evolution of 1325 and the subsequent resolutions and where we think moving forward with an intersectional approach. Think about the title, Women, Peace, and Security, and rather than gender. And so by maybe expanding the focus to gender, one can examine those structural inequalities. And this would also entail considering the impacts of war and conflict on boys and men, as well as girls and women too. Another critique, and again, thinking about the ways it can be improved over time and using intersectionality, is it tends to ignore or minimize the contribution by the Global South. And so sort of quoting Sumita Basu that, it tends to be further marginalized at the international level. So sort of, again, thinking about if we think, what impact and role the Global South can tell us. And again, this is the post-colonial scholarship as well. And so, thinking about what do we lose by looking at the issue from just a traditional perspective and what is gained by doing intersectional value, and so forth. And this is actually recognized by the international community. One of the things that was interesting when we were researching the book, thinking about since the adoption of 1325 is in 2021, UN Women actually published an intersectionality resource guide and toolkit, specifically as a way to recognize structural barriers that contribute to inequality, and these structural barriers often impediment to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that were developed back in 2015. So it's interesting to see how even thinking about 1325 and 2000, where we are 25 years later, and how also the UN is recognizing these much more broader things of gender, race, class, and so forth.
If I could try to focus on a very, very current and relevant, important issue of, for example, the example of Ukraine. I mean, one of the early case studies you both provided in this book is this ongoing war in Ukraine. What does an intersectional feminist analysis of this kind of conflict reveal? And how does that differ, maybe, or enhance an analysis from the more traditional IR or even a political science perspective?
Kristen, you want to start that one?
Yes, one of the first images that I remember after Russia invaded Ukraine was this picture. It was in the Washington Post. Maybe a lot of you saw it. It was a photograph of a train station in Poland with strollers. And it was Polish women generally bringing strollers for Ukrainian women, who have now fled the conflict, fleeing Ukraine, and obviously bringing their children with them. And for me, sort of the feminist intersectional gender analysis lens, like what is this, like unpacking all of that, right? So you have women, mothers, women mothers in another country that's helping these women as they're fleeing. So when we think about the invasion and traditional IR, it's okay, Russia invades Ukraine. But sort of again unpacking that and saying, but what are the effects of that invasion, and how does an intersectional analysis help us understand who is able to flee? Right? It's more than just a conflict between these two countries, but. And again, this is not minimizing the importance, obviously, of the impact of the war and obviously waging it, 3 years later in 2025, but sort of asking those questions: who's fleeing? How are they able to flee? Who has to stay, right? Who can't flee, right? Who is forced to stay and fight? One of the things that was interesting is the Ukrainian government passed a law that basically said that, men of age, I think it's 18 and above, could not leave, right? And so when we're looking at this larger thing of Ukraine and Russia and this conflict, unpacking what's happening underneath might help us understand what the actual dynamics of that conflict are. Joyce, if you want to add more to it.
Yeah, I would. And thank you for that context, because that image of the women in the train station is so haunting. But why is it important to go beyond the traditional IR? If you look at the way in which the traditional IR security would approach the war, they look at it as a conflict between two sovereign states. It was an invasion by Russia of Ukraine, another sovereign state, in violation of basically all the principles of international law. So it looks at it from a very macro level perspective. Even asking questions like, why did Putin do it? It's still a very broad traditional approach. Putin wanted more territory for Russia. Putin wanted to regain the notion of the old Soviet empire. Those are very traditional IR approaches to understanding why one country chooses to violate the sovereignty of another. By looking within, what we can ask is really, who is affected by that decision? In other words, it's more than just one country invading another. It really is who made the decision, who is affected by the decision. And what does that tell us about the dynamics of that war itself? Generally, the coverage in the media of the war, with the exception of at the beginning, pictures of women fleeing, holding children's hands, we don't see much about that. We don't see much about the impact of that war on different groups, on women and men, on ages. And again, because men of a certain age couldn't leave, what impact did that have on the families? The traditional approach doesn't ask those kinds of questions. And yet, I think we would contend that you can't really get a full understanding of the war, of the impact it had and is continuing to have, without looking within at the differential impact of the wars on the various groups. One other thing, I was listening to a podcast, I think it was The Daily, and they were talking about how Russia was getting soldiers to fight. And they were getting soldiers to continue to fight by giving, especially young men, a huge amount of money. Um, so it became not about fighting for your country anymore. It became about fighting for, enlisting for the money. And that, again, changes the dynamic because it asks, who are these men? Why are they joining? What group within Russia is affected, and what impact does that have on their families? Again, that is looking within to ask a different set of questions.
If I could stay within this women and security, peace and security discussion, I was struck by one of the report you cited from the International Peace Institute in your book, that women are seen as legitimate participants in the peace process, building peace, but not seen as legitimate participants in a process that intends solely to end violence. This war, peace, and security issue seems especially urgent today in Ukraine, or with rising authoritarianism, wars, conflicts, and few existing prospects for negotiating peace agreements. The insights gleaned from your case studies appear very relevant here. So how might it be possible to accept women as legitimate participants across that peace and conflict spectrum?
It's like the $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I was thinking about this in the context of Ukraine when Joyce and I wrote that part in the chapter. And at the time, there weren't women negotiators in the peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And I'm thinking about, I think that's still the case in 2025, even today. And it makes me think about this question about the ending violence and the building peace, what that actually is going to look like. And how do we push forward for having women, those voices, and multiple women. It's not just, again, not just monolithic, but sort of think about which women should have a voice and have a seat at the table. And again, sort of thinking about durable peace in the future. It's really problematic. Joyce?
Yeah.
No, and one of the examples that we often come back to for that is the example of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, which I think is just a great example of the difference in approach to understanding building peace versus just ending violence. The Northern Ireland Women's Coalition came together specifically to get women a seat at the negotiating table that eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement. And when it was created specifically as a bi-communal organization. So it brought together women from the Catholic and the Protestant communities, which was part of what the goal was. In all of the literature about the coalition and their experiences at the negotiating table, and there's a plethora of books that describe this, it really illustrates clearly the difference in the way women approach building peace to end a conflict versus men who see simply the end of violence as equal to peace, and they're not. So the men focused on things like decommissioning the militias, giving up the weapons, and saying, if we can do that, then there will be peace in Northern Ireland. The women said there will not be peace until we address the underlying causes of the conflict to start with. And so the understanding of what peace means was very different. For the men, it was, if we don't have the militias anymore, if they put down their arms, then the violence will end and therefore there will be peace. For the women, it was, no, peace is far more than that. Peace is understanding why there was conflict in the first place, addressing those concerns. Some of it comes back, and Kristen and I were talking about this the other day, the idea of Galton's structural violence. You have to address the underlying causes of the conflict. Now, as we all know, the Good Friday Agreement did not address the underlying causes of the conflict. And while there's so-called peace in Northern Ireland, there is still an undercurrent of that violence. Some of the militias morphed into gangs that are now doing things like selling drugs. I mean, the problems did not totally go away, even though the violence is not as overt, because those underlying causes were not addressed.
So you also talk about sort of injecting women and gender into our understanding of these fundamental issues, but they not only change the answers, they also change the questions we should be asking. And so for you, having done all this research and analysis, what questions should we be asking in today's current complex and transitional political landscape?
A great question. We always come back to our friend and colleague Cynthia Enlow. So where are the women, right? The bottom line, where are they? And again, asking the questions about who's making the decisions, thinking about one of the things that Joyce and I talked about recently was like immigration, right? How are different groups affected by these decisions, in what ways? One of the things I've been thinking about too in today's, as you said, today's very complex political landscape, I was thinking a lot about sort of the Trump tariffs. And the reason I'm going to answer it this way is how, sort of larger question of how do the range or does the impact of a range of policy decisions affect various groups within a society? And I was thinking about, again, this idea about Trump's tariffs, and not just obviously for the United States, but sort of globally, right? Because this is the IR part of it, right? Which is this idea that, how do we unpack the impacts of those tariffs in various countries? And so I was looking at some data for the case of India, and some research I found said that the 50% tariffs that Trump is putting on India will have a really detrimental impact on the textile industry in India. And this can lead to job losses and a very highly labor-intensive industry, but it's an industry heavily reliant on women. And so in thinking about this larger political landscape about U.S. foreign policy, Trump economic tariffs, and so forth, it has these impacts on the various countries in doing this particular foreign policy. And so I think about which women in India, which men in India are going to be impacted by this tariff, what kind of industry is going to be impacted. In this case, like I said, the textiles, and that's a large export for India. So those are the kinds of questions I'd be asking about drilling down in things such as economic tariffs, the economy, security issues, and so forth. We see also, just looking at the news yesterday, I think it was on the BBC, just about the backlash now in India, very much about anti-Americanism in a function of that. So those are the kinds of questions I'd be asking about. What are the impacts on these kinds of foreign policy decisions that are being made, and who's being impacted and how?
If I can add something to that, Karin, to your question, and I think Kristen gave a really good example with the textiles in India. And that is decision makers, and this comes back to some point you raised in your introduction. Decision makers don't think about these things. They don't think about what are the differential impacts of these policies on various groups, because they look at the macro level. I mean, obviously Trump's tariffs are all about the United States and supposedly equalizing the playing field. And yet, from an academic perspective, as researchers, we get different answers when we look at that question. Not only, okay, what's the impact of the tariffs on US relations with other countries, but what are the impact of those policies on the people within those countries? And what does that mean? And how is that then going to affect what happens in other countries, which will in turn eventually affect the United States? So it's a much more complex and often nuanced question than just, well, what's the impact of the tariffs? Which is a broad macro question, but when we ask what's the impact of the tariffs within these various questions and within these various countries, and how then will that then change the relationships, which will in effect change foreign policy. So it's far more than just looking at what are the impacts of tariffs. And I think unless we go within it, within a country and ask some of these questions, we're missing some of that detail.
I think that for me also is the importance of the book, is to just simply acknowledge complexity and not sort of trying to stay at a level where we miss a lot of not just the questions, but the answers. And for policymakers and for us, what the implications are in a much more broader vein. So in terms of final thoughts, what is next for the field of intersectional international relations? I guess if you were to redo the book now, what would you add? Where would you focus your analysis? And if I could also add, we had also discussed sort of looking at the discipline itself and of young up and coming scholars in the field, and the importance of this book for not just for undergraduates, for others who are looking at trying to look at IR in a different manner, sort of how, where are the gaps? Where would you also, in terms of just adding, where would you focus your analysis? Where do you think the gaps are, and where some of the future scholarship can be for young scholars in this sort of gender, peace, and security field?
I mean, those are great questions, and I think they're important ones. I'd like to think about the second part of your question first, about the discipline itself and young scholars. And then we can come back to the other part, which is if we were doing the book now, what would it look like? Because I think it would look different than it did. As I started off in my remarks, Kristen and I were both trained in very traditional IR. And so getting to the point of looking at IR through a gender sensitive lens, if you will, required some real rethinking and learning. It's certainly on my part. Doing the book required learning a lot about a whole different approach and a whole different literature, the intersectional approach. I would encourage young scholars, especially in IR now, to really think beyond the bounds of very traditional IR and to ask a different set of questions. And to be reminded that you will get a much richer understanding of the field if you move beyond just the traditional major approaches. That doesn't mean abandoning them. I mean, both Kristen and I still write on very more traditional security topics. However, for me, having gone through this intellectual journey of understanding and learning about feminist international relations, now intersectional approaches, I look at questions, I look at issues very differently. And I find even if I don't explicitly bring it into my work, I think more about it. And I would encourage, especially young scholars, to remember that you're not losing anything by bringing this in, or bringing in a different approach. It just will allow you to think of things in a different way. So that would be my admonition or my advice to younger scholars coming through the discipline now. Kristen? And then I'll be happy to go back to the other
Yeah,
set of questions.
I 100% agree. I think that there's so much that needs to be studied that we don't know. And as we all know, scholarship is knowledge production. And I would encourage young scholars absolutely to ask these intersectional questions. What are we missing if we don't ask those questions? Or as Karin, you're asking the question, it made me think about even in the United States and now going from Department of Defense to a Department of War. Like, what does that mean? How do we understand masculinity? How do we understand femininity? What does this mean about class? What does it mean, if LGBTQ folks can't be in the military anymore? I mean, all these ways in which thinking about an intersectional analysis helps us. And so I would encourage, keep doing what you're doing. We need that information. We need that scholarship. So absolutely do so for sure. And then for terms of answering the question about what I would add to this, I think Joyce and I have talked about this. Maybe obviously Gaza and Israel, that I think would be an important thing to think about, adding that as a case study in the thing. I would like to think about the impact of declining democracy around the world. What does that do for us, and understanding what that matters for us, the impact on human rights, human security, including women's rights, all these ways in which of thinking about democracy and declining. I'd like to focus on the gendered backlash that's coming from right-wing populism that's converging globally. That, again, unpacking that kind of information for sure for the book. And given the role and power of the United States in the international system, sort of what's the impact of Trump 2.0 and the administration, and seeing about what's happened to USAID, the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues. Think about foreign aid, the impact. The Lancet, as you know, just published an article just in June talking about the impact from the reduction in foreign aid in terms of adult and child mortality around the world. So those are the kinds of things I would want to pick up if we were to do the book again. You're muted.
Please speak now.
Sorry, yes, sorry. Any other comments?
I think for me, as I said, this has been a real intellectual journey, and it's been a very interesting and exciting one. And I want to come back to Karin, the question you asked earlier about 1325, because it really forced me to look at 1325 in a different way. And again, not to diminish the important role that it had, but just to say maybe we need to be more critical in thinking about some of these things. So as we think toward the future, how can we make them better and stronger, so that it's not only about women and peace and conflict, but it's about how all groups can benefit from the end of violence, from the end of conflict, and in truly building peace in a different kind of way.
Thank you. This has been a very, very encouraging discussion. I think it allows us to think expand our own understanding of what's possible. And kind of analytical opportunities that we'll have and scholarship and otherwise. And we thank very much Joyce Kaufman and Kristen Williams. Thank you very, very much for your time, and good luck with the book.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk about it and for such interesting and insightful questions that really had us thinking more about some of these issues. Thank you.